Yeah, good morning, everyone, and welcome. Uh, Wendy and I are judging the Mairtín Crawford Award this year, which is a very special one. Mairtín was such a great supporter of emerging writers, and the award is for someone who's working towards, hasn't published a first collection yet. And so we thought we'd just have an informal chat about the short story, all things short story, and we'll leave some room for your questions at the end. So we can see the chat here, so get popping your questions in the chat and we'll leave like 20-30 minutes at the end for that. But first of all, welcome Wendy. So chance to do this with you. Wendy and I go back maybe 25 years, which feels very special. And Wendy, I think Wendy is one of the finest short story writers that's working today. I love that I was one of Wendy's first editors when I published some of her first stories. And Wendy is such a good teacher and so wise on all things short story. So this is going to be brilliant to have a chance to chat. So Wendy, I wanted to ask you first of all, say if you've always wanted to write a short story, but you haven't yet, or you're just setting out, like where'd you get your inspiration? I'm tempted to sort of imagine Stephen King style, that there's kind of you in your particular patch of the world. There's you, there's Jen Carson, there's Rosemary Jenkinson. It's a part of the world that I return to. Is there like a shop in Ballyhack that you go down the back and there's a bucket?
Well, can I just say it's absolutely brilliant to be here this morning to talk about short stories with one of my favourite writers and favourite people. It's fantastic. But that whole idea of where do these things come from? The thing I always think about, Lucy, in terms of any kind of inspiration is it reminds me of, when you go to if you go to an amusement arcade and there's the penny falls, and you just keep putting in a few coins, and you're hoping that there's going to be some kind of configuration that will cause you to have a sort of a payout. That's the way it really works with me with short stories. So normally what I start with is that I just have a couple of ideas that are these are things that you wouldn't say plots or anything like that, but just a couple of ideas. And I'm thinking, are these things in some way going to coalesce? So it's probably best if I explain this in relation to a particular story, maybe. So something like, say, a story Mathematics, which is about a woman who cleans Airbnbs basically, and she finds a child there. I've been thinking about different sorts of things. I've just been thinking about how in every hotel room I seem to leave something behind. There's never a hotel room where I haven't left like a blusher or a moisturizer or my phone charger or whatever. And I was just thinking about, you go into these rooms if you're a cleaner, what are you getting from the people that have been there? So there's that dimension. And I was also round about the same time as that rereading Silas Marner and George Eliot. And so I was thinking of that idea of how coming across a child can be a really transformative thing for somebody. So I was thinking about that. And also as well, I was thinking about something that somebody had told me ages and ages before about working in a kitchen in a restaurant and having someone come into work, and they were told to cut up they were shown how to cut up a carrot, and they were told to cut up potatoes in the same way, and the person had very, very laboriously cut the potatoes into the same little shape as the carrot, and they'd done this so carefully, but that wasn't what was required, and yet they'd followed instructions so carefully. So those things were sort of swirling around in my mind, and that's the way it always is for me. It's about 3 or 4 very disparate little ideas. And then what I do is that for whatever way that happens, that triggers an idea of a person for me, a character. And so that's, I suppose, where the story starts off, because I start trying to think, right, who's coming to mind here? What person? Always sounds really Doris Stokes-ish, but Mystic Meg. But what person or what people are presenting themselves to me out of this kind of concatenation of ideas? And I don't write anything initially. For about a month, I just think about it. Don't really make any notes, but just think about these people and try and get to know them, as it were. And then I write a very long first draft, but we'll maybe talk about that later. But what about you? Where do these?
I love this idea of the arcade with the pennies. The image that I had, it's kind of different image, but kind of similar. I always think of it in terms of kindling. Like I think that you have all this stuff that you've amassed, and then there's a spark, when maybe a couple of things come together, and suddenly all this stuff that you've accumulated is a light. I'm working on a story at the moment. That's a young Irish production of Hamlet that's set in New York. And I'm thinking it's really funny looking at the places in my life. In that story, it's the first time I've written about my own university experience, which is where I had a whole paper on Hamlet. And I think that's really funny, for like 20 years, I haven't written a word about university. And suddenly this story requires it. So something that's been there the whole time, there it is in the story. Um, I was in New York recently in the autumn. I was thinking about Good Vibrations. I went to New York, that's directed by a friend of mine. So I was asking him questions, and you sort of see all these different places that a story has come from. This is kind of a bit more embarrassing, but I was watching season 2 of The Tourist with my husband recently, and he thought it wasn't as good as the first season, and I was insisting that we kept on watching it. Didn't quite know why, and then I suddenly realised my character is Jamie Dornan. But it's like the way that he's kind of, I don't know, a bit morose in that film, but he's like, okay. And there was something, and I thought, this is so funny. I'm channeling him. I'm putting him in a different form into my story. So it's really funny the ways that those different places, things, people come together. But I think it's what I always think, Wendy, and I know we've talked about this before, is it's so easy to wish that you had a different set of life experiences, right? To think, if I'd grown up in a more exciting place or at a different time, I would have better stories to tell. But I think there's something that we both agree on, that, there's no such thing as an ordinary life.
No.
Like every single life is extraordinary. And it's kind of that Chekhovian thing, I think, that that and maybe it's almost a sort of like mystical thing, that attention is a sort of form of prayer, and attention to details. It's really interesting, but if you put even very prosaic feeling, seeming things into a story, the attention that you give to them by putting them there, a kind of miracle happens and it starts to be really interesting. So I think that's something that I always feel, it's there in, Martin Buber, it's there in all the great mystical traditions, that the treasure is always under your hearth. Like Silas Marner, he's counting all of his gold coins, and the treasure is really like the gold of Effie's hair. So it's like, I always think that you have what you need, and the stuff that you have, the straw that you have, is the stuff that will turn into gold.
Absolutely. I mean, I could not agree more. And I mean, I see a lot whenever I'm working with kids a lot of the time, and I can see kids whenever they're setting a story, they immediately go to set it in New York, or they go to set it in Barbados, or somewhere really far flung. Um, and they always want it to end with something incredibly dramatic, with people being killed, or something that's incredibly splashy. I'm kind of like, what, why did you set it in New York? And it's always just what you're saying. People are like, it's boring. If I set it where I live, if I set it on the Castlereagh Road, it would be boring. It wouldn't be boring. It's actually boring having a the absolute cliched story set in New York, or having everybody having this super splashy ending which comes out of absolutely nowhere. That it's not boring. People having a cup of coffee in the Castlereagh Road is not boring in the right hands, with that attention to detail as you're
Yeah.
as you're
So
saying.
on that note, I wanted to ask you, you know, a lot of people have the impression that the opening to your story has to be, I don't know, car chases and gun battles, and if you're, what would it be about an opening to a story that that grabs you?
Well, Lucy, I just think the opening has to service the story. And so I suppose I'm going to be saying this such a lot during our conversation, that it just depends on what you're trying to do. It's maybe not very good, it's maybe not very helpful advice for people if they're wanting something incredibly specific. But I suppose that the opening just depends on what it is you're trying to do. But there's one thing that I really, and I'd be so interested to know your views on this, because Um, Sometimes the advice that people get when they're submitting work for maybe competitions like this is that your first page or even your first paragraph has to be some sort of showstopper, that this has to be something absolutely bravura writing so that a judge goes, wow, that's absolutely incredible. And so, what I think sometimes happens is that people almost overwrite that first paragraph because they feel so self-conscious about it, and they've been told that, a lot of people don't read beyond the first paragraph if it doesn't absolutely grab them. Um, and it's a bit like the person who at the party stands in the doorway and kind of goes ta-da like that, and then they sit in the corner and really quiet for the rest of the party. So I kind of think that the first paragraph of the opening has to be something that is in keeping with the rest of the story. So there's all sorts of openings that I like. So say for example, I think when you look at a lot of the Chekhov openings, they are really low key, and it's really kind of like at this time in this place there was this person. Um, it's orientating the reader very, very quickly. So I like an opening like that. I think that works brilliantly. I also love
Yeah.
those openings where, it's really widescreen at the beginning. It's almost like a panorama, and then it moves right down into something specific. I love that type of an opening. Um, I suppose Claire Keegan always says this incision in time is so key. Where are you going to make your incision in time? Um, I like it when I feel the person has made the correct incision in time, that they have gone, reasonably close to where it is they need to be, and I'm not getting a whole unnecessary kind of preamble, I suppose. What about you?
Yeah, the incision in time. I mean, that's just a
Isn't
brilliant
it?
thing, isn't it? Yeah. Well, yeah, I would agree, and I'd say that when I'm reading something, you don't have to wow me at all. I just need to feel that I'm in safe hands. And that can be something very quiet. It can be something very steady. The image that I love of a short story, maybe most, is Mary Levin's, great Irish writer. And she talks of it as an arrow in flight. And so I think there's something when you start a short story of feeling that you're already in motion. You don't have to worry. The story from the first line, the story is underway. And I think that because of that, there's no point worrying too much at the beginning when you're starting to write your story what the opening's going to be, because how on earth do you know where the best point is to start when you don't know what the story is? You don't. And so I would think the opening, Anne Enright always talks about the opening of a story has to contain kind of like the story's DNA, everything. We're like fractal style. It has to contain everything that's to come. And so I would just say, and I do it myself as well, if you're just starting to write, don't worry about the beginning. Don't worry about getting the beginning perfect. Like, just get into the story and just get started. And so often the beginning is the last thing that I will write, or the beginning is the last thing that I will edit, because I think when you know where a story is going, that's when you can sort of look at your massive material and you think, okay, well, why does it need to start here? Could it start a couple of days later? Could it start a couple of minutes later? Where is the David Mamet does a similar thing where he says, with his short stories or with his plays, he always finishes them, and then he cuts off the first scene because that's just limbering up, and then he cuts off the last scene because that's just indulgent. And so that's what he has. What remains is a play. And so I think there's something, if you write the beginning last, or at least edit the beginning last, or at least choose your beginning last, I think you probably have a clearer idea of what the story is. And so you can start in a more confident way, without trying to do the pyrotechnics, all the pyrotechnics of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. That whole thing to do with, when you start, you just do not know where the beginning is. So it's such good advice that you just begin, but where you begin is never where your beginning is ever going to be by the time the story is developed. And that should make people feel, that should just relax people. That you've no pressure on you whatsoever. This is a decision you'll be making way down the line about where you want to actually begin the story for your reader. Just start and see what happens. And I love what you say as well, Lucy. You don't need to be wowed. I feel like that too, and I kind of feel like short stories are like people in the sense that do you want to meet people constantly you're wowed by? I don't really, you know. I want to meet people that are gentle, the people that are wise, people that, you know, are all sorts of things, but not necessarily people that I'm just sitting there wowed by for the duration. It sounds quite exhausting, to be honest.
Yeah.
So you there's all sorts of ways of stories operating.
How do you know? You mentioned earlier that you will think about a short story for a long time before you start writing. Um, how do you know when you're ready to write?
When I'm just so excited about getting it down, I always think I'm not really a super materialistic person, but every single metaphor I'm using here to talk about writings involving money, um, what I feel it's like is whenever I have got loads of back in the day, whenever you would have had coins in your pocket and you were turning over the coins, thinking, "What am I going to buy in the shop? What am I going to buy in the shop?" And it's sort of exciting. Whenever I've got that feeling that look, I got stuff here that I think is quite exciting to me. I've got people that I think I want to write about. So whenever I feel quite excited, that's when I start. But whenever I start, I'm doing it exactly the way that you were saying, where I just begin. I don't know where this is going. I don't know what's going to happen. I just begin and I write a really, really long first draft. And it's just a pleasure, that first draft, because there's no restrictions on me whatsoever. I change. I nearly always write the first draft in first person, but it could be all different first person narrators, could be going all over the place. That's just how I begin, and there's no pressure. I don't know if it's going to work out or not. I just go with the flow of this first draft, just wherever it takes me. What about you?
This is
What do
so
you?
interesting. Yeah, similarly, my first drafts, I always think that, if you're Michelangelo and you're carving your statue, at least you have the block of marble to start with. But I
Yeah,
think if you're a writer, you need to generate that whole big block of marble before you can even start. And
that's
so I would tend to think about a story for a very long time. And I would just be walking along the street and sort of listening to my characters speak. Quite often I get lost. I was walking my son to school a few months ago, and we were just kind of walking and chatting, and he sort of said, why are we walking this way? And I walk into school every single morning. We had turned completely the wrong way just because I was so involved in the story, and it was, I didn't know where I was going, but I would walk, I would listen to the characters in my head. I would make notes on my phone. And what I tend to feel is that something seems to, it kind of almost bubbles up to the surface, and for me it sort of bubbles over until you have to write. And my story, All the People Were Mean and Bad, I thought about that story for more than a year before I wrote a single word of it. And the moment I realized, oh, this story, it's a tone, I could suddenly hear this story is an elegy. And that story starts with the narrator, second person, flying back to London from Toronto. And it's an elegy because her cousin has just died, but it's also an elegy for maybe her marriage. It's an elegy for all the people she thought she'd be and is having to come to terms with the fact that she's not. It's an elegy for all the things we think that we'll do in our lives and won't. It's an elegy for all the paths not taken. And I suddenly, as soon as I could hear, oh, this is an elegy, I think I wrote that story in the first draft of it at least in 2 days. I just wrote it. I could just hear it. In other times, this Hamlet story I'm working at the moment, totally messy first draft. Like the perspective will change, everything will change. My work this week is I finished a very rough draft of this story. I think of it as a sort of like blocks in place. Like all the rough action of the story is sort of there in the right order. But it just wasn't working. And so I gave it to a friend who always reads my work first. And I said, I'm really struggling with this. What do you think? And he had the idea that if I there's a big slab of backstory in the story, and he said, well, why don't you try that in present tense? And so my work this week was all day Wednesday, I retyped the story, big long story, um, in present tense until I got to a point where the present tense didn't work. So then on Thursday, I retyped this whole story back into the past tense again, and did some cutting, did some editing, did some sort of tightening. And there's nothing glamorous in that. But then by Friday, I had decided, okay, there's sort of too much. I need to get rid of this character and I need to have just this character telling it. And so I sort of sheared off a chunk of it that was just felt a bit too much. So, there's nothing very glamorous to that. It's just going over and over and over the same material, trying different tenses, trying different things, tightening, kind of feeling it just because with a short story, it has to be. I love the Kevin Barry image of a high wire act. If it sags, the person walking tumbles and all is lost. And a short story, because it has to be the even if it's not very, if it is not car chases or gun battles, it has to be taught and it has to be essential. And so you're just trying to get it to the most I suppose, yeah, essential version of itself.
I think you can see there how much work goes into your stories,
Yeah.
Lucy. And I think that's one of the key things. It's not just as well. It's the thinking time for these things, and not just as well the writing time, which also can be so extensive. And so, I remember one time somebody saying, could you provide us with short story hacks, right? And the answer is, well, no, because there aren't any. There's no short story hacks. Now, there's obviously things that you can say in terms of editing, and there are certain things that you can do that might give you a different perspective. So yeah, we can maybe talk about those later. But in terms of the actual work, I don't think there are any short story hacks. And we had in my workplace, we have, rather than a book group, we started doing a short story group, and our first story was All the People, so that was the one that we talked about. It was, I can honestly say, it was one of my best experiences of last year, because it did that thing that those sorts of discussion groups can sometimes do. It can take people that have known each other for many, many years, but give them a different way of talking, And we talked about your story for an hour and a half, and I reckon we could have talked about it for another hour and a half, and it was because there's the complexity and the nuance that's there, you know, it is just so incredibly rich. So it doesn't surprise me that you spent such a long time thinking about that came to fruition over such a long period. I got a story, 77 pop facts about Gil Courtney, and that was
And this story, every single person who has read this story has Googled this person. I did it to convince it is real, thinking this is you do that. There's a kind of magic in that story. It's impossible to believe that this character is made up.
well, thank you so much. I had written that about 20. It was about my usual first draft is probably about 20,000 words, and because this was a lot to do with a sort of a faded pop star monkey kind of thing, I really enjoyed writing the first draft, but I couldn't make it come alive. It was just it just was just like, who's going to want to read about all of this? And I tried it, Lucy, so many times. I tried it from the point of view of the guy. I tried it from the point of view of his mother, because I thought this is actually really a story about a mother and a son, which is just one of the things I'm always interested in writing about. But there was so much other stuff that the mother story wouldn't facilitate. And then I thought, maybe what about a burglar? That was I thought my bright idea, that a burglar would come into their house and see all the kind of artifacts to do with his life. And that was the worst. That was terrible. And then it was a chance conversation with somebody, and they said you need to make the form and the content need to be more in parallel or tandem. And then I thought, right, okay, and I get it. It's going to be like smash hits or whatever, pop facts. And I got the story written in one night. And I had worked on that for well over a year, and I'd had long drafts in various different forms. So
Isn't that funny? I think as well, something that I always remind myself is, hard as writing can be and torturous as it can feel to be writing the same story. Okay, present tense, let's try past
yeah,
tense, let's do this
yeah,
isn't working, what do I do? To remind yourself that this is a playground, not a prison. You
yeah,
know, this is a thing to have fun with, and this is a thing to try different things with. And I think one of the things I love most about a short story is if you finish a whole novel and you realize, okay, maybe it should be present tense, you've got a big old slog ahead of you. But with a short story, because you're talking like maybe Mairtín Crawford is up to 2,500. You're writing, maybe your stories tend to be a bit longer, Wendy, but you're writing maybe, 8,000 words, seven. It's
mhm,
some manageable. It's something that you can try a whole different way. And the short story, I think it would be very hard to sustain your pop facts about Gail Courtney over the length of a novel, because a reader would kind of get bored. You as a writer would need to keep doing new things to keep us interested, do unexpected things. For a short story, you can do things like tense forms that you wouldn't normally use, or you can do a smash hit style thing, or you can do a multiple choice personality questionnaire, or you can do something very traditional, but you can have a bit more time and room to play, I think.
Totally, totally. So I think that's just what's so brilliant about this as a form, because sometimes people can make it seem so very kind of like it's so disciplined, and it is these things too. It can be these things too. It's so disciplined, rules, regulations, all these kind of sort of protocols. But it's so exciting what you can do. Things that would be just that would just be unattractive over the course of a novel. You can do it's just endlessly flexible, and also as well so democratic, in the sense that if you've got a lot else going on in your life, you probably might be difficult for you to write a novel if you've got all sorts of other responsibilities, if you're a carer or whatever. But a short story, it is absolutely so doable, at this particular length. And it should be, as you say, I think it's a lovely way to describe it. It should be a playground. It should be fun. And if it's not enjoyable, then you have to think, why do it?
Yeah.
If
I spent Wendy, I spent about 10 years trying to write short stories, and none of them worked before they finally started coming alive. And it was a really curious thing, because by the time my short stories started working, I published 3 novels, like several stage plays, monologues, all this sort of thing, and I could not get my stories to work. There's a poem by Sylvia Plath, um, a very dark poem called Stillborn, and she imagines her poems that don't work in sort of apothecary jars, and she says they smile and smile and smile at me, but still their lungs won't fill and their hearts won't start. And I would feel that I would think this is a really good idea for a story, and I would finish the story, and it would feel like it maybe tried to flicker into life and then just shriveled up. And the story, instead of, I think a good story needs to unfurl in the reader and grow in you afterwards. And my stories just did not do that.
Why
And
was
then
what, Lucy? Do you think
what I realized I was doing is I was approaching the short story as a miniature prose narrative. And I was thinking, okay, so it has to have, this beginning and middle and end, and it needs to be. I realized that that's not what a short story, that's too literal a way of thinking of a short story. And when the sort of image that worked for me for a short story was, I started thinking of a short story as a spell. And I started thinking, okay, and I was writing at the time, I was writing, all my stories of like girlhood and East Belfast teenage girlhood. And I thought, okay, what I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to capture something of a feeling. That's the most important thing. And so I started writing short stories whose purpose was I thought, if you, these words in this order, Larkin says something quite similar, that these words in these order will produce an effect for the reader. It's something that's palpable. Yeah, and so I started writing my short stories. I started seeing them as spells, and so that kind of freed them up from the idea of plot. It freed them up from, they could just be maybe they'd have a lot of plot, maybe they would have it a little bit, but it freed them up to be about what I was more interested in. And I think that it's interesting if you look at, Chekhov, Catherine Mansfield is like this. All these great innovators of the short story, they've kind of found ways to make it their own. Chekhov by writing about his, little people, as he called them, and Catherine Mansfield writing about intensity of emotion, and writing in a more impressionistic way. There will be a particular way, it may be that thinking of a short story as a spell is useful to some of you listening. And if it is, go with it. But I think there will be other particular ways of thinking about the form. Because I think the short story form isn't just a miniature novel. It's got that, it's got an intensity akin to a theatre play, that you see all in one go. You can't read a short story like a couple of pages a night. You have to read a short story all in one go, I think. And like a poem, maybe a short story can have more sense of formal intensity. There's more pressure on words, there's more pressure on the blank space on the page. So I think for me, it's yeah, there's something interesting there about what the short story is formally.
Do you think that the short story makes different demands on on the reader, or do you feel that you need to think differently when you're writing a short story about the reader than you do when you're writing something longer?
I think the short story, the reader, why it's quite an intense experience, like reading a short story collection often, is that the reader needs to do a lot of the work. And I think that's partly why when I say a short story needs to grow in you, I think a short story needs to have space. And partly, your words are limited, everything's limited. And I think a short story can demand a lot of the reader and needs to ask the reader to bring a lot of themselves to it. Where I think
Mm,
a novel is a lot more forgiving for a
mm,
reader.
mm.
A novel you can read like a couple of chapters in the bath. You can read a paragraph before bed. You can forget what's happened and go backwards and pick up. And a short story, you can't do that. There's something taught, something pulled very tight about the through line of a short story.
Because I do think, when I'm reading people's short stories, um, I would like them to know that I am willing to meet you halfway with this.
Yeah.
So I am I am expecting and I want to do some work.
Mhm.
And I will enjoy that, and it will make the story richer for me if I have had to, say, project beyond your final full stop, or if I have had to um, make certain connections or assumptions. You do not need to tell me to explicitly. I am willing to work, and I will enjoy doing that. So I suppose when I'm writing, I'm thinking about the reader quite a lot, and I'm thinking, um you know have I if I don't spell this out for a while, is the person going to feel annoyed? Is this going to be something that's just like an irritating thing, or is this going to keep the person continuing? How long can I withhold things before somebody starts getting annoyed? Um, if I just give the person this information about the character, is that enough? You know, will they be able to? Do they know these types of people, and will they bring their own knowledge to the story of these sorts of people, and will that be a more enriching experience than me giving a paragraph of physical description of this person that locks them out from
Yes.
imagining themselves? So to to me, the reader, and anticipating what the reader might think is a
And
is a
you're
lovely
so
thing.
particularly good on that. I always think, Wendy, that there's a story of yours that I love, that a woman is having this sort of fantasy about this man, and and when she meets him in real, that she kind of knows, but when she meets him in real life, she realizes that he's wearing those shoes with like the rubber bit to go up the back of the heel, and everything is like fantasy killed dead. She could never, be attracted to a man who wears shoes like that. And you have so many kind of tiny particular details in your stories. Where do you get those? Does that come from observing people? Does that how do you decide what are going to be the details that are going to sum up a person or that are going to sum up a character?
Right. Well, I suppose yes. I am observing people a lot of the time, and I am just a nosy person. And my daughter. We were sitting in Tim Hortons in Belfast, and my daughter filmed me for about 5 minutes, unbeknown. Like, I didn't know she was doing this, and it was just me looking at everybody that came into Tim Hortons and just like looking them up. Not judgy, but genuinely just interested in all of these people. So I am noticing things a lot of the time, and I kind of think that um if you can get the right type of surface details, those surface details suggest great depths, if you can manage to get the right details. But I remember hearing Claire Keegan talk about this, and she was saying that she felt that too much detail, say for example physical description of a character, ends up shutting a reader out.
Completely.
Whereas I heard Elizabeth McCracken, who I think's great too, saying the opposite. She said she can't buy into a character if she doesn't know physically what they look like quite early on.
That's
So
so
two great writers, two
interesting.
totally different.
And I felt, to kind of add a whole different dimension to that, for years I used to think that I was a bit of a fraud as a writer because I could never tell what my characters looked like. And so sometimes in like my early books, there would be kind of a slightly artificial description that felt really false at the time, but I just thought this is a thing you're supposed to do. And then I realized with my short stories that it doesn't matter that I don't know what my characters look like because I'm experiencing them from the inside. You know, I'm not sort of seeing them from the outside. I'm doing the intensity of feeling of what it means to be inside their body. And so there might be things about the way that they move through the world, like they might be tall or they might be short, or and then that becomes relevant to what they look like or what they might have chosen to wear. But that's the way that I you know, feel character intensely from the inside. So external physical description doesn't kind of matter so much.
No, exactly. I mean, but we were talking earlier on about that person that chopped up those potatoes in the shape of carrots, right? What kind of hair that person had or what that person was wearing is utterly irrelevant.
Yeah.
That
That
that's the
detail goes deeper, doesn't it?
that salient detail is the one that is important, I think.
Yeah, brilliant. I wanted to kind of to move away a little bit onto a different topic. This is a topic with which I'm a bit obsessed, Wendy. How do you end a story well? You know, how do you know when a story's ended? What makes a good ending? I'll put my cards on the table and say
Okay. Okay.
I am convinced that all of a short story is all about the ending. It's all complete. I think that everything, you know, from your opening, from your first word, everything is building towards what I think of it as what is the final note that you're going to strike that keeps on, you know, echoing? What's the final image? And, you know, I think of with there are different demands if you're ending a novel. You know, there's threads to tie up, there's all that sort of thing. But I think sometimes with a short story, as with a really great sort of maybe slightly more arty film, you can end something with some image that suddenly it's as if everything comes into retrospective alignment. You know, as a reader, I think you can be reading a story, suspending your need to know anything until you get to the ending. Or it can be, I mean, maybe an ending is mysterious, maybe an ending pivots everything that's happened before. But for me, it's all about the ending for me. And I would always kind of have a sense, I think, by the time I start writing of what it, even not what the ending literally is, but what I want the ending to feel like.
Mhm. And I think that's really good. I think what it feel the feel. I think that's our like the sort of tenor of our conversation here. That it's a
Mhm.
feel of a thing a lot of the time, right? What I'm going to say here probably sounds the opposite of you, but I actually think it's the same. I do not. I don't like stories, and I've written some like this. I don't really like stories where the meaning of the story resides in the ending. So, do you know the sort of story that's almost like it's like a Shakespearean sonnet, and like the ending is like the rhyming couplet at the end. It's like, oh,
Oh,
that's it.
yeah, like,
Done. That was
yeah,
it.
yeah.
And so you read, and then suddenly in the final paragraph, it's like, oh, right, and he discovers this, and all is revealed, right? But I don't think that's what you're meaning at all, right?
Mhm.
I I think the story should be working hard the whole way through. So that's that idea that right from the very beginning, you are not simply just building up to an ending. That what you're doing is that every paragraph is in some way crucial to the story as a whole. Suppose what I'm saying is that your duty is to the story and not the ending, and and the ending is part of the story as a whole. And
Yeah.
so sometimes I think, right, let's lop off the final page here. Is this story still of interest? Has all of this in its own right been has it been significant the whole way through? And if you can kind of think, yeah, all of that has been important, then good. And I think
Yeah.
that's
I
basically
remember
exactly the same as what you're saying.
when my short stories weren't working, I heard Kevin Barry, I was chatting to Kevin Barry, and he said that uh, beware of having all of the revelation of the backstory in the penultimate paragraph. And I
Yeah.
just thought, oh, I felt kind of like a chill run through me. And I kind of went back through drafts of stuff thinking, have I just in my penultimate paragraph, have I just like given the crucial missing piece of backstory? You know, so I think Claire Keegan again great short story writer. She was asked a question about an ending once, and she said, I was in the audience, and she said for her, it's like pushing a bike off and freewheeling down a hill. She has no idea how far she's going to get or where she's going when she sets off writing a story. She doesn't know what the ending's going to be.
Mhm.
But I wonder if that's maybe after you've done a couple of drafts and you do know what your ending is. I think this is where we get to, that's when you can start. There's a phrase in cinema, the assembly cut. And
Mhm.
that's when you just sort of have all your stuff together and you're starting to work out, okay, what goes where? What's the best order for this? What's essential? Where do I start? Where do I end? What can get tightened?
Yeah. I mean, that thing that we were saying before about Claire Keegan and the incision in time, I sometimes think about it as like if you're getting blood taken or whatever, that you've got that where the needle goes in and that's your introduction, that's the beginning of the story, and that's a risky thing for you, because how are you asking people to leave off the real world and enter your fictional world? But also when the needle comes out, that's also, you don't normally feel it, you don't really feel the needle while it's in, but then when it's been taken out you feel it again. So it's another risky point for you. Where are you going to ask them to break off from your fictional world? And
Yeah.
it's the
Yeah, and I think it's a really interesting question to always ask yourself. I always ask myself, and I ask it if I'm working with anyone in their work, I call it the why this day question, you know. And I think of all the days we could possibly see,
Mhm.
why this day, like why aren't I seeing yesterday? If you think of the Hemingway story, The Old Man and the Fish, you think we don't need to see days 1 to 89 where he doesn't catch anything. We know that something's going to happen. We're seeing this day for a reason because something is going to change. And so I always ask myself, why am I seeing, why this day? Why am I starting here? I think it's a way of, again, making it essential of kind of cutting as tight to the action as possible and trusting that the reader, there's something that I always used to see with theatre work is that a sort of young playwright or a rookie playwright, um, someone who was just starting out, they would quite often there would be a kind of scene that was a bit inert at the start of their play, and you'd ask them, what is your intention with this scene? What is this scene doing? And they'd always say, oh well, things are about to go wrong, and so we need to see the family happy, or we need to see the couple happy before everything goes wrong so that we know what they're like. And you think, actually no, an audience or a reader, we can pick up very quickly on what things were like. What's more interesting to watch dramatically is the moment of change, or the moment that things start to change. And I always think that why this day question, there's something kind of magical about a short story that I think, and quite often I think a lot of early stories that people write, as was the case with mine, certainly, tend to be coming of age stories, because you can most clearly see it with a coming of age story, that there is a difference, something has happened between the beginning of the story and the end of the story, something irrevocable. You
Mhm.
know, with coming of age, it could be someone literally growing up, or it could be someone learns something that they cannot unknow. Someone goes from innocence to experience, something is lost, something is gained, something's understood. But I think that sort of question of why this day, what is going to be fundamentally and irrevocably different by the end of this story? And I think as soon as something as soon as that change has happened, you can end the story. And it doesn't need to be, we don't need to see the, so with sort of, it's almost like you can imagine in your head and you can play on your page, okay, what would this story feel like if I started it earlier?
Mhm.
Or say there was a deliberate thing I did with All the People Were Mean and Bad, which is actually based on um, the Chekhov story Lady with a Dog, which is basically a series of endings. And I have a hunch that Alice Munro's Bear Came Over the Mountain is also based on this Chekhov story, because that story is also, every time you think the story is going to end, there's another part of it. There's another sort of chance at love. There's another. And so
Mhm.
what I did with my story is I very deliberately, that story starts with the plane taking off and the characters on the plane. They're expecting the story to end when the plane lands. But then the story doesn't end. The husband isn't there to pick the wife up. So you sort of get this weightless feeling of what happens if you continue the story after we expect to end it. You get this sort of time in which all things are possible. you get this. And so I think and you can play as a writer, you can sort of toggle. You can think, okay, what does this story feel like if I open it a day earlier or a year earlier? What happens if I let the action continue after it's finished? And then you can choose in the edit where to make your cuts.
Mhm. And whenever we talked about that story in our group, people had all sorts of ideas about how they felt life was going to continue, and how she was going to feel about the decision she'd made later on, and
Yeah.
what people imagined further down the line. And I think that's as well such a the gift of the short story as well, that there is that idea of future time that you're kind of co-opted into creating, if you're willing, as a reader.
I love that. Can we talk, we're sort of edging towards it, but can we talk about editing?
Okay.
Because isn't it interesting that when we've both talked about writing short stories, it's like maybe to summarize the sort of fun and the wild freedom of writing a first draft and not expecting your first draft to be any good at all, not even expecting your first draft to be the point of view or the tense or even the main character that the final story will end up being. So there's that kind of wild freedom. But as you start editing and as you start making these decisions, and what are your best editing tips? What would you suggest people they do?
Right. Okay. Number one, do not be romantic about this. What my first tip would be: do not be romantic about this at all. We've talked about the real fun dimension, right? And there is an absolute fun dimension to this, but there's also as well an utter graft dimension to this. And you just have to regard it the same as if you were creosoting a fence or you were having to paint something huge or whatever. This just takes a lot of time and a lot of work. So I got a massive first draft. What I do is I read over it, and I kind of read over it in a really
On
dispassionate way.
screen? Do you do it on screen or
No,
do
oh,
you
no,
print it or yeah?
right. I print things out. So I would print out that first draft, and I would read over it, and I would be really brutal with myself and these people, and think what is of interest here, what's not. And sometimes it's very surprising. What I think was central when I was writing is absolutely not. Um, then what I would do would be I would start again from scratch, rewriting it totally from scratch, but looking a little at that first draft, bits and pieces that I might have liked. Print it out again. This time when I print it, practical aspect, I would print it landscape, and I would print it so that it's in columns, so that the one half of the landscape page has got the story and the other half is blank, so that when I'm going through it the next time, I can just be writing notes the whole way. So I would do it like that, and then I would probably do that again, Lucy, or maybe again, and all of the time, yeah, that's laborious, but all of the time, there's also a lovely feeling of this thing that the way you described it. It's tightening, it's becoming taut, and it's taking shape. It's like what it reminds me of. It's like if you've been in a dark room and you see
Yeah, the image floating up.
yeah, it's like that. Through that editing, it is laborious and sometimes it can be frustrating, but you see something is coming into being in a way that the first draft, as you say, it's just like stone, or it's like, I don't know, clay or whatever. It's there, but it's not something that's existing as whatever you want to call it, like a piece of art or whatever. It's this is what you feel that's becoming as you start working on it.
Yeah, there's a different sort of pleasure for me to an edit. I always love the sort of the wild freedom of a first draft, no obligations, nothing. But I think the pleasure for me in an edit is there's kind of almost like a perverse pleasure in that graft, in doing that graft properly. And for me, the thing that I would do, I read that Joan Didion did this, and I read that she got it from Hemingway. So it's a pretty tip with pretty good provenance. And I read it in her Paris Review interview. And if there's anyone watching that doesn't know the Paris Review interviews, they're brilliant. You can buy volumes of them, or you can subscribe to the magazine and have access to their online archive, or quite a few of them are posted in their entirety online. And they're just writers, great writers, talking about their craft. And this tip that I got from Joan Didion when I was quite young, it has served me so well. And it is that every single draft that I do of something, I will print and I will print it and I will retype it back in. And that's the way I think I find it impossible to edit on screen. I can't write longhand because I never learned joined up writing. So my my handwriting is atrocious and also very slow. So I type my first draft. But I find that if you're trying to edit on screen, there's something that looks too finished already, and it's really hard to like lever apart space between the lines for different things to happen. But what happens if you print and retype something? It makes it harder to keep that sort of lazy thing that you think it's not very good, but I need it to get to here. You know, if you have to retype that 4 or 5 times, it's kind of sticks in the craw. It's going to have to go. And also, what I love is I always think that you want to keep your story live and provisional until the very, very, very last draft. And if you're retyping, you have room for the more you work on your story, the better you'll know the world and the more your characters will start coming to life. And so if you're retyping, if a character suddenly says something, maybe in 7 drafts of this story, they haven't said it, and then they suddenly start saying it, and you can just go with that. And you think, okay, if this doesn't work, I can just, I can just cut and select and delete and go back to the draft that I have. But for me, it's a way of both tightening and keeping the story alive until the very, very, very last moment.
I could not, right, that is always the way I've worked, and
Yeah.
I could not agree more about all of that. It's just it's so easy to be lazy when it's on the screen and think, oh well, that's an approximation of what I'm wanting. I'll just leave it for now. And then suddenly that's forgotten about, and then that becomes part of it. It just keeps
You're
it.
right, I think. And Wendy, you always say as well that you will change the font of something in order to see it differently.
Yeah, so I'll change the font of things to see it differently. I think as well I'll sometimes print it different ways to, and do you know another thing, I'll actually read it different places. So I'll actually sometimes take it and go and read it in a coffee shop or whatever, and think, right, well, what am I thinking here? Just a different space sometimes gives you a different idea. I remember one time you telling me, Lucy, and I think this is just great. It's always worked for me. Is sometimes if characters aren't, sometimes if something's not right with a character, it could be you've given them the wrong name. Can you remember you telling me that?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
sometimes they're trying to tell you that is not my name. And sometimes the character just becomes so much more themselves whenever you change the name. And it sounds like such a basic thing, but it's actually quite profound.
Yeah, it really is that you will find, I think that, yeah, I mean, I don't know if it's nominative determinism or what it is, or the associations we have with names, but you will find if you're really struggling with the story, if you change a character's name, I don't know, a Wendy will do things that an Iris just wouldn't. It's really funny. That it is a sort of magic. The ways maybe it's just giving a fresh or different injection of energy into a story. Yeah, I think that's a really good thing. I think in terms of editing, I would not do this, but I know people do. Um, Reading your story aloud. The reason that I don't literally do that is I think I grew up playing the violin like from when I was about 4, and the way that I learned the violin was Suzuki method, which is a sort of Japanese method where you never actually learn to read music. You listen and you repeat. And so with all of my stories, we've talked about tone, we've talked about, I can always hear the rhythms of them, I can hear the tone of them. And so sometimes I will read a story just kind of listening to it, and I will sort of play a story in my head, kind of listening to it, listening for those false notes. But I think if you don't have a musical training, it can be a really, really good thing to read your story aloud, because even if it's just in an empty room to yourself, because you will kind of stumble on rhythms that are incorrect. And it's all of that kind of to the tightening of a story and the keeping a story airborne as well. You don't want those little, you don't want it to snag. You don't want a reader's attention to be pulled away from it at any point.
I yeah, I do read mine aloud, but that's one of the things that I actually should do even more of, because whenever I read both the books for I did the audiobooks, Audible books,
Okay.
of the two of them, and whenever I was reading them aloud in the studio, both times there were points where I was just going, oh, why did I do that? Why, that's not right. The rhythm of the way that person's speaking, or just how that moves, it's just not right.
Yeah.
But at
For
the
me,
same
the moments you suddenly realize how you should have edited your story are like 10 minutes after you've sent it to your editor is one big one. And another one is when you are literally reading from it at a podium,
Yeah.
trying
Yeah.
desperately to edit it as you go. Wendy, who would you, in terms of we've both talked about sending work to people or getting people to read it.
Mhm.
I think it's really important the people that you choose to give feedback on your work. Um, how does that work for you?
Well, I think I'm a bit of a loner in some ways in terms of writing. So I don't normally send it to loads of people. Um, and I think it's wonderful if you have someone that you know though. I do send my work to Declan Mead in Dublin from Stinging Fly as a friend. He's my friend, and someone that will be really honest with you, and someone whose judgment is not colored by the fact that they're your partner or that they're your very good friend or whatever. Somebody who's going to give you honest feedback, but without being really really unnecessarily brutal or cruel, because that's just not helpful. But I honestly think, Lucy, that one of the key things that you have to develop as a writer is your own sense of what you think works. And so, you know, I don't think anybody's writing that's been kind of got there by sort of majority consensus in terms of what works is really good. I just don't think that that's the way it should be. And so I suppose you're wanting to develop to a point where even if your trusted person says I didn't think that worked, that you can say, well, respectfully, I think it does, and that's a good place to be in. I just think that if you're in a writing group, there's always so many other currents that can be there. If you've got someone that has been really very abrasive unnecessarily to other people whenever they've been presenting work, you kind of know that whenever it's their turn, there's going to be a bit of a payback time. So sometimes with these things, there's so much that you need to factor in terms of personality. So the more
Yeah,
you get it that there's something not like that, yeah.
yeah, I would be the same. I'm quite a private writer, but I think the important thing is to think when you're giving work to someone, what are you expecting? Like, what is this relationship? I always used to give when I was like in my early 20s and writing publishing, I always used to give everything that I wrote to my mum because she would just be, and now that I'm a mum, it's like my child, you're so proud of the fact they've done anything. And it's like, that's kind of valid. What I needed from my mum was this, this is brilliant, you're wonderful, I can't believe you've written this. And that's as valid as anything, but then at a certain point, especially when I was writing my own stories of motherhood, and I stopped giving them to my mum because I she might not get them, she might not like them. I know they're not her sort of thing. And
Mhm.
so that makes it a kind of unequal. It makes it, well, what are you seeking? Are you seeking permission? Are you seeking validation? Are you, in the same way, Wendy, my husband is an architect,
Mhm.
and he reads a bit, but he's not particularly a reader. I would never give him stories of mine because if I give him a story, he will say something like, "You don't actually mean a Velux window, you mean a Crittall window." Yeah, at a certain point, yeah, that can be really useful. But if you want someone at the wrong point of a story, all it does is it makes you really frustrated with that person, and you think, "Ah, just don't talk about the window. Wasn't this story so moving? Wasn't it?" And then
So,
especially say if you're writing about you're not necessarily writing about yourself, but you might be taking something from the relationship or from children that is, it's like, yeah, my husband is not the person that I'm going to have this discussion with. And so it's kind of interest. And as well, I would never send work to my agent for editing or for approval because I think, okay, what I want from my agent is I want him, as it happens, I want him to be an advocate for my work.
mhm.
He is not the person that I'm going to come to saying, and different people have different relationships with their agents, but mine, I want him to just be an advocate for my work. I don't want that to be muddied by me saying, oh, I don't think that I'm a writer anymore. I think that it's left me. This story isn't working. What do I do? But I do have friends who I will share things with. And my editor, I'm lucky enough to have worked with the same editor for a long time. And what you build up, if you're in a writing group with people you trust, is you build up that knowledge of and familiarity with each other's work. I think that someone knows your work, they know what you're trying to do. And so there's no question of, or there's a lesser maybe question of shame. You don't need to worry that someone is judging you. You can present something and someone knows the way that you tend to write. And so they're able to give advice on that in a way that's maybe kind of more balanced, because will also be giving advice on their work. So I think it's those questions of I think it can be very damaging to show work to the wrong person or to a person at the wrong stage.
Do you think it's useful, Lucy, whenever you're showing people your work, to have specific questions that you want to ask them about it?
Yeah, sometimes definitely. Sometimes like with my Hamlet story earlier in the week, that just wasn't working. I sent it to my friend who's a crime novel who writes, like 600-page crime novels. They have nothing to do with the sort of stuff I write. But he's a good editor, good teacher of writing. And I sent that to him and I said, like, I know the writing is objectively bad. But what I need to know is I've got this big sort of chunk of story in the middle and I just don't know what to do with it. And that's why we had the conversation about, okay, present tense or this, or, can you try?
Yeah.
So I did give a very specific, sometimes you just want someone to know, is this working?
Mhm.
But
Mhm.
yeah, sometimes I will ask someone very specifically, can you read this with a view to this?
Yeah, I mean, my the question that I'm most often asking people whenever, so one of my friends read that, so I'm working on a novel, and one of my friends read it, and my question for him was kind of like, do you buy this? Do you buy this? Whenever this person says this, do you buy that? Right? You
Yeah.
know, does this feel? Can you get on board with these things happening? Um, and so I think that's quite useful if you know there's specifics that you would like to know somebody's response
Yeah.
to. And then if they decide that they want to come in with other dimensions, absolutely fine. But I sometimes ask people, if people are showing me their work, I will sometimes ask, well, what is it you want to know about this? Whenever I was as you were, Seamus Heaney, fellow at Queen's, and whenever people came, I said, look, what is it you're looking for from me? Do you want a pep talk? Are you basically wanting just some affirmation, which is fine, there's nothing wrong with that? Or are you wanting something hardcore in terms of feedback? What is it you'd like, and give them what they want.
Yeah, I've seen people as well that have been, and in my early 20s, I was sometimes in a situation where you realize how psychically damaging really it can be, it being sort of torn apart in a writing workshop. Not as bad as architecture. My husband talks about how they put your work up on a board and the tutor will literally rip it apart and say that it's rubbish. It doesn't quite get that bad in writing workshops, but I think sometimes it can be, we talked about how people can give well-intentioned feedback, but all the interesting jagged bits could be rubbed off by group consensus. And I think if people are giving you it's getting to know as well. I remember in my first writing groups, there were some people who, if one person in particular said something, I would always listen because I knew that his instincts were really good as regarded my work. There was one other person that I really, really liked as a person. I liked having a pint in
Yeah.
the pub after the workshop, but anything this person said, I would just let it go. I just knew that this was just not helpful, just not relevant. And so again, I think it's you want someone who will help question your defaults, but you want to sharpen your own instincts.
Mhm.
And I think sometimes it's better not to, if someone has given you very enthusiastic feedback, it can be too easy to think, yes, this is what I must do. Always, I think, let things settle and trust that the right answer will
Mhm.
sort of stabilize inside you.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah.
Let's go to some, we've got questions from people in the chat here. Let's see what they are. Okay, well, there's a test question. Okay, test question received.
Yeah.
Um, Lovely. Yeah, this is a nice question, Wendy. Applies to both of us. Hi, Mary. Thank you so much. And Mary says, do you have any tips for trying to find time and headspace to write with a full-time job and children? Um, Yeah, Mary, I wrote for about 10 years. I just wrote short stories, and I was the main carer of my young children, partly by financial necessity, but mostly by choice. And I found that, yeah, I could not write a novel, but what I could do was I could sort of hold myself psychically open for the sort of the length or the size or something of a short story. And I would find that as well. It's that we've talked a little bit about this, Wendy, haven't we? That so much of the work isn't when you're sitting literally typing. Like what I would be doing is I would I would have dedicated writing time, I think is really important. And I would have Tuesday morning and Wednesday morning, I'd have like 2.5 hours where my husband would take the kids, and that was my writing time. And I protected that time so ferociously. You know, we were in a flat and I couldn't work if I could hear the babies crying. And so I would just say to my husband, you have to be gone. And it didn't matter if it was, November, I'm completely pissing it down with rain, wasn't my problem. This was my time. They needed to be gone. And what I would find is that the first day would be awful, second day would be a bit better. Third day, I'd be like pushing a buggy along the street, like typing notes to myself on my phone. And then my buggy broke and we got this really nice secondhand Silver Cross buggy, but it had you couldn't bump it up and down the curb with one hand. And so my writing life almost ended because I could no longer type notes to myself as I walked. So I had to get a different buggy that I could, push up and down the curb with one hand while still typing to myself. Um, but I think it's the realizing that it's up to you to make time. And I think especially for writing, especially in a family situation, um, you're not visibly creosoting a fence. So it's too easy for people to not think you're doing anything. It's too easy for that time to be intruded on. So I think the first thing is finding the time that works to you and protecting it ferociously and thinking this is time that you need psychically. If you're a writer, that's something that's really important. It's not about the publication or the awards. It's about you feel most fully alive and at home in this world doing that thing. And so you make that space and you make that time. And Wendy, I mean, you have your kids are a little bit older, but you have kids and you have a full-time job. How do you make that work?
Well, I have to preface what I'm saying here that if you got my kids, like so my kids are older. I mean they're much older now, but they were younger whenever I was writing the first book. And if you got them in here, they would probably say that I was a pain. And still am, that I get so zoned into what I'm doing. I literally can't hear them. They said you've got your writing headphones on, that I literally do not hear them whenever I'm working. So in a sense there is a sort of a selfish dimension to me as well, that this is very important to me, and sometimes I will zone out. Um, people in my family and my kids or whatever, if I'm working on something. Um but that said, I do try to be decent most of the time. But I think so. There's a few specific things. I think number one, don't discount a small amount of time. So sometimes it's very easy, and I do this as well. I mean, I am not wonderful all the time at doing this kind of thing, but you've got half an hour. It's so easy to think to yourself, oh sure, I'll just sit and have a coffee and read something, whatever. There's no point trying to start some sort of work, or no point trying to get on board with any writing. But even half an hour can be really precious. So even if you've just got little windows of opportunity here and there, just try and take those, and don't be too brutal on yourself. So you've got this, say for example, I was always working. Once we had our tea, we cleared up, whatever, I would then try to write, and try to write for as long as I could before I'd have to go to bed. And sometimes what I wrote wasn't really all that good because I was tired or whatever. That's okay. Don't be hard on yourself. You tried your best that day. See how it goes. See how it goes the next day. So don't like obsessively read over what you've written and go, oh, it was terrible. Look what I've written. It's awful. Get down what you can, move on, try again the next day. And that's just how I do it. A lot of the time I was always writing at the kitchen table.
Mhm.
So I felt that what I didn't want to do was take myself away from where everybody was, and I tried to sort of integrate my. It sounds very pretentious to say it this way, but try to integrate my sort of creative practice into just the general environment, the home. I don't know if that was a great, in retrospect, I actually don't know if that was a great idea, because all it seemed like was I was just constantly sitting day after day, in the same spot working. It might have been better, I think, to have sort of segmented it off and gone to a different room or whatever. I don't
I
know.
mean, it's worked. I mean, whatever you've done
Well,
is
it's
well enough,
work when
yeah.
I actually move. I move to this room now a little bit more. But I
Yeah,
suppose it's
I
just
think
use what you
enough
can.
message, yeah.
Don't be too precious. And I'm not saying that anybody necessarily is about this, but try and do it where you can. People shouldn't need special category circumstances. I don't think that you need to have be seized by the muse or whatever. Just try and do what you can when you can. And for me, I try to do it fairly regularly, but that's not the way everybody works. So it might be totally different for other people. Maybe if you're able to get a big blast at it, that's more profitable.
Yeah, I was discussing writing and motherhood, especially with young children, with Kerry Doherty, brilliant writer, and
Mm.
and the image that we came up with was the image of a poppy. Like, you sometimes in summertime you get these amazing poppies. They're so beautiful, and they're growing from like basically a bit of like cement dust. There's nothing. They need very little, and I think it's exactly that thing, Wendy, that the little bits of time and little kind of cracks of time and things can grow. Things can grow. I think routine is really important. One other thing I'm going to say, Mary, before we move on to the last couple of questions is and this will sound quite left field, but I think keep a dream diary. And I don't mean some kind of big leather bound book that you write in with fountain pen. I do one just on my phone, just on my notes on my phone. And I wake up, and if I've had a particularly striking dream, I just type down the main bits of it. And I think that what you're doing, all that you're doing really, is that you're creating a bridge between your subconscious and your conscious waking self. Because so much of the why write and what are these stories and where do they come from, and it's too easy to talk in mystical ways about being possessed by a character, and that's not useful. So it's easier to focus on the technical stuff. But I think if you can do something even in your your quotidian life, if you can find ways of keeping that bridge open, I think it's just some magical things can start to happen, I think. And I think what you want to do is, you think of, like, I think my life is kind of quite quotidian in so many ways. I'm married to a man and we have a house and we have 2 kids. But I think what I always want to keep fiercely free is the kind of wildness of my imagination to go different places, and I think that having kind of that knowing that however prosaic and pedestrian the circumstances of your life is, there's an Auden poem that talks about the crack in the teacup, that's the road to the land of the dead. And I love that. I love Hilary Mantel, loved that. And I love the way that there are these cracks, there are these in all of our lives, there are these strange and wild forces and freedoms, that we can have, that we can make sure the pathway is clear to. Let's see, a question from Claire here. Wendy, what is this sweet spot for you in terms of word count? How long is too long to be considered a short story?
Oh, right. Well, I'm not going to be very much help here when I just say, Claire, that a story just needs to be as long as it needs to be. I know that is absolutely no help whatsoever, but my preferred length, I suppose, it's not that I'm ever deliberately trying to hit this length, but the length that I seem to hit quite a lot is round about 6,000. And for me, that's a length that allows you to have quite a lot of complexity and quite a lot of, because one of the things I like to do is kind of run quite a lot of different timelines, and that type of length allows for you to do quite a lot of that. And it's just a length that I know the rhythms of as well. I kind of know what needs to keep the sort of momentum and to keep the shape of it. I kind of know how the rhythms of it need to work. But sometimes I've written things that are much longer than that, and I've written things that are about 11,000 words. And then I've also written things that are much shorter. I suppose what happens though is sometimes they're sort of quite artificial because of competitions and just the sort of practical sort of imperatives of competition. Certain word limits are placed, and so I've never been writing my work as such for I've been very, very lucky in that respect that I haven't been writing necessarily for competitions because I've been writing for two collections, and it was there was no problem really whatever length these stories were going to be. So I suppose if you know from the beginning what the sort of constraints are for you in terms of a word count for competition like this, that is then a parameter in which you're going to have to work. That might not necessarily be my sweet spot for the particular type of stories I want to write, but where I enter in this competition, that's then just how I would need to think in terms of the rhythm.
Yeah, I should say for the purposes of the Mairtín Crawford competition, it's 2,500.
Yeah.
And actually that length, that's quite a familiar length to me because I write stories quite often for the radio, for Radio 4, and the word count is always, Wendy, you've done it too, it's always
Yeah.
2,100. And sometimes, pardon me, sometimes I'll finish a story and I'll think, well, this is 2,200. I'm really struggling to cut it. If the actor speaks a bit faster, we'll get all the words in, and they never do. It's always 2,100. And I think that's quite a useful length to be able to get a story up, get it working and kind of bring it back in. If you can turn a story in like 2,000 words, that's quite neat. But I've worked with people who have really, really struggled. Their natural length, they're a bit rangier, and their natural length is like 8,000 or 9,000 words. My stories in Multitudes are quite short. And at the time I had two young babies, and my stories are in there. They're maybe 2, 3, 4,000 words, rarely any longer. In recent years, my stories in Intimacies, similarly, were quite short. My new collection openings, they've got longer. The two stories that I've just finished are a kind of gargantuan to me. They're about 8,000 words each. And both stories are very technically complicated. So I think I'm doing things that I could not have done, 5, 10 years ago, and the story needs more space. But again, I think there's no, it may be that you naturally have a length that you know the rhythms of, as Wendy said, that feels right for you, but also, different stories, different demands. All right, well, I'm going to whiz through some more questions here.
Okay.
One from Marissa. Hi, Marissa. Would you be able to speak more about the something fundamentally different at the end of the story and the conscious decisions you make or don't in search of that, and what the feeling can include for you? Okay, goodness. Yeah, so I think that for me, a short story, there's the way of seeing a story as an epiphany or as a glimpse. It can kind of lend itself to a quite static sort of story. What I mean by something fundamentally different is maybe that epiphany can be a realization after which life is not going to be the same again. It can be like in because we've talked about in my story All the People, and that's online, you can get it and read it. The thing that's changed is after that story, maybe the narrator will no longer be able to unknow the fact that she's unhappy or her marriage is in trouble, or maybe she's come to a decision that actually she's going to put that back into the box. But there's something has been realized, something has changed. And I think for a short story to something fundamentally different, it's like there's been a bridge, something has been crossed, you've taken the reader somewhere with you, and things are not going to be the same. That's not necessarily the way that all short stories should work. That's just the kind of way that I think of them. And I think when you've reached that tipping point, when you've reached that tilt, or there's a short story that I've loved for years by David Foster Wallace, and it's called Forever Overhead. And it's just if I say to you, okay, what's the plot of that story? Young boy, 13th birthday, he decides to dive from the top diving board in the YMCA pool that he's never done before. And the whole story, all it is he gets out of the pool, he walks along the concrete, he joins a queue, he climbs a ladder, he walks along the diving board, and the story, he sort of jumps into the air and the story ends. So if I say to you, okay, what's happened in that story in literal terms, like nothing very much has happened at all. This is what I mean by plot, by when I tried to stop making my stories about plot. But also in a way, everything has happened in that story. The boy has grown up. He's no longer a boy anymore. He's grown up. The story stops at the point where there is no way back. You know, at a couple of points climbing the ladder, he's thinking, a man is saying to him, "Kid, is this too much for you? Do you want to climb back down?" And he carries on. And at the point the story ends, he hasn't yet hit the water, but it's too far for him to go back. The story has sort of gone beyond that tipping point. So I suppose when I'm saying something's fundamentally different, a point has reached where something has been done, something has been realized, something has been changed that you can't go back. So even if in plot terms, like that story, it's a good example of what I'm trying to say, because that story, almost nothing happens, and yet everything happens at the same time. And I think when you're writing a short story, maybe your short story has loads of plot in it. Some great stories do. You don't need very much plot, but you do need that sense, I think, of something having happened, of having been witness to a moment of change.
Mm.
Wendy, would you want to add
Yeah,
anything to that?
yeah. I suppose when I'm reading, a two-word question that is often in my head when I'm reading, and particularly when I finish reading something, is so what? So what? Right?
Yeah.
So whenever I get to the end of a story, and I'll just go, so what? Like what what
Yeah.
what was the point? Right?
I love
Um
it. That's so harsh. This is like,
I
I have
know.
the say question and then the so what question. Yeah, brilliant.
And it's kind
It's
of
so
like,
chilling.
so what? It can be something that, it can be something that the events have been absolutely huge, but I'm thinking, and so what, right? Or it could be something that something really, really minor has happened, but I've cared about it terribly, and so what? Massive, so what? Like, it's a real big deal. So it's just by the end of it, what was the point of that? And I don't mean obviously like a didactic point or some sort of some message that you're trying to convey, but what was the experience of that story,
Yeah, we've got two more questions here
Okay.
before we'll have to bring it to a close. This question is from Jay. Thanks, Jay. Jay would really like to know if either of us ever had the experience, sorry, excuse me, of during the editing process, of feeling that instead of your story getting tauter, it's getting away from you, or that the central image is eluding you. And what do you do? Yes, Jay, I put together a story for some of my students last year to give them a sort of true picture of what a short story might be like. And I put together the different drafts, not even when I was doing editing in document, just the different drafts of this story. That this story was so bad that I quarantined it off in its own folder so it didn't infect anything else that I was writing. And I had, maybe when I put all the drafts together, and I put like the emails back and forth between me and the person who read it. I put the emails from my editor, who at one point his note was just, "I'm really sorry, the story isn't working and the children's names really annoy me." That was it. But this document, when I put it together, it was maybe 60 or 70,000 words long, all for a 6,000 word story. And that was just an example of, yeah, the story just, it just kept on eluding me. It just kept on, and there was no magic pill, there was no magic advice that anyone could give me. It was just a question of yeah, just trying it again and again, every so often, to see if I could get it to work. Wendy,
Yeah.
have you had that?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And this happens absolutely. This happens absolutely all the time. And sometimes it can be that what I'm doing is I'm trying to insist too much on the story I want to tell, rather than what this material is presenting. And maybe I thought I was going to be writing a story about this, but subconsciously, really, it was a story about that, and I don't want to go down that avenue. So sometimes there's that you need to work with what you've got rather than try to impose on it what it is you were thinking you were going to be doing. But other times it just doesn't come alive. It just doesn't wake in some way. And sometimes as well, I think you just sometimes have to, well, I have to just acknowledge my sort of limitations, that there's some things that I just can't actually do. I don't have those particular skills at this particular point. So there's lots of stories that I've tried to tell, and I just think in terms of my execution, I just can't do it, and I've sometimes felt quite regretful about that I don't seem to be able to do it, but that's just the way it is. But you just need to think, right, well, that's the beauty of this form. That one didn't work. Let's move on to something else.
Yeah, and I do think, Jay, I would say that we've been talking very much about, and maybe it's just Wendy and I working in a similar way of, writing a lot and then tightening and editing, and Brian Moore would work like that. But say a writer like Toni Morrison will say her first drafts are very thin and sparse, and for her, editing is all about adding and augmenting. And she would say that with every new draft of a story, she is seeking to make it bigger. She is seeking to add texture and add color and add detail, and bring the world to life. And I would kind of caveat sort of everything that Wendy and I have said, and I know we've referred to other writers who've been important to us, but there are no ways of doing it. There are as many ways of doing it as there are writers. And if you're sitting there thinking, my stories always run away from me, I don't know what to do, it's not a problem with you, or a problem with the way you work, or a problem with the story. There's just a different methodology. And so say maybe you're writing something longer and it needs to be augmented. I can't read your work, so I can't tell, but never let anything that someone else says or suggests be a golden rule, I think. My voice is just about to give up on me, so we are on our final question, which is and thank you all so much for it. Some lovely comments in the chat. Thank you so much for that. A question about what are we reading at the moment, Wendy? Lovely question. What are you reading? What can you recommend?
I am reading Spent Light by Lara Paulson. Lara Paulson, I just think, is one of the most wonderful writers. This is published by CB Editions, Charles Boyle Editions, and it's kind of like, it's sort of fiction, non-fiction, and it works. It moves. Each paragraph moves in a sort of an associative way. Lara was a foreign correspondent. It's just a fascinating book. It's adult reading, right? I read it and I think this is an adult woman writing here who has got a mischievous, interesting, really intelligent take on the world, and I think she's just wonderful. What about you?
Oh, lovely. Yeah, well, I'm looking at the books on my desk, and I have Hamlet, I have R.D. Laing's Sanity, Madness in the Family, I have Tom Stoppard, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are Dead. I have brilliant book by two books by Paul Griffiths called Let Me Tell You and Let Me Go On, that are Ophelia telling her story in only the 481 words she's allowed in Hamlet, which is brilliant. It's one of those constraints that transcends its own constraints and becomes something truly great. But I think if I am going to recommend one, I've got this here, just published by Faber Editions. This is a book called Neighbours by a writer called Diane Oliver, who died when she was just 22. She was very tragically killed, and she writes African American families in the John Crow era. But her stories, they are gothic and unexpected and so precise, kind of emotional depth, but also such technical control. It's kind of it feels such a loss that this writer died at 22, and so it feels like she deserves a life through her stories. So if you're interested, yeah, Faber Editions just published Diane Oliver. So
Brilliant. Haven't read.
There we go. Yeah, good recommendation. I'm sorry, I've had such a cold all week, and my voice is just about to give up the ghost. But thank you all so much for being here, and good luck with entering the Mairtín Crawford Award. We look forward to reading your stories. I think useful to say, stories, double check eligibility, word count, all the rest of it. Stories are read anonymously, which I think is really freeing. When I started entering, I remember the competition. I'm not a big competition enterer, but I entered the BBC award with one story because I thought, it's anonymous. No one needs to know if anything ever happens to this or not. And so I think all the stories are read anonymously, and so there's a kind of freedom in that. Also, don't worry if your story doesn't get anywhere. You just have to think that on a different day with a different bunch of judges, maybe even if we had our judging meeting an hour later, could have been a different. When you're entering a story for competition, don't send off your sense of self-worth and your sense of yourself or anything else at the same time. I would caveat it with that. I've been on all sides of short story writing competitions, long-listed, short-listed, one. Sometimes a short story that I think is really good has not got anywhere with publishers, competitions, anything. So just with that final caveat, yeah, have fun and good luck.
Yeah, I could not stress that more either. It's so important that everybody realizes that, of course this is just one competition, two people at a particular moment in time making a particular judgment. It could be so different at a different time. Yeah, absolutely. I would
Brilliant. Thank
exactly
you.
same thing. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Wendy, thank you. Such a pleasure
It's a
to
pleasure to
talk to
speak
you,
to you.
Wendy.
Lovely Saturday morning. Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you all so much, everyone who's joined us. Bye bye. See you.